go ahead and get started, I think.
Well, welcome everyone to the final session of day 1 IIIF full working meeting. My name is Melinda. I'm Associate University Librarian at Cornell University. And in a moment, I'll go around and ask the other editors present and Glenn, who's going to join us, to introduce themselves. Do I have the names of everyone is the question? Rob.
Hello, I'm Rob Sanderson. I'm Director for Doctoral Heritage Metadata at Yale University. One of these.
Is Mike able to join us? Sorry, this is a little embarrassing. Is Jeff with us?
Yes, I'm Jeff Mixter. I'm a software engineer at OCLC, and yeah, I'm here.
Thanks, Jeff. Dawn? Len, do you know if Dawn was going to join us?
I think she is, yeah. She might have been called away.
Okay. Well, why don't you introduce yourself, Glenn?
Okay. So you heard from me earlier. I'm Glenn Robson, the IIIF Technical Coordinator. So I'm not an editor, but I do kind of hustle them and make sure that the community is represented in their editor meetings. But yeah, pleasure to be here.
Glenn is wonderful at helping keep us in line. Okay, and Tom Crane.
Hi, I'm Tom Crane. I'm Technology Director of Digerati in London and Glasgow.
Oh, how exciting.
Not at the same time.
Okay, so just by way of preface, this session is about scope and reflections. Of course, a lot of the last discussion was actually about scope. I think this is an absolutely critical issue on today's topic of how do we keep IIIF current. I think we need to think about scope and about how large our scope is so that we can have sufficient focus and sufficient effort to get things done within the IIIF community. I think I'd like to note just two things as one of the IIIF specifications editors. One is that our specifications aren't completely done and finished when we release them because the environment around them is changing. We hope they become mature and stable, changing only very slowly, but that won't mean they're entirely static. So the more specifications we have, the more upkeep we're going to be faced with. So that's a reality. And the second is that I think we have a really great set of design patterns, which if you haven't read them, I'll just paste the link into the discussion channel. Pretty good. And two of those, the first two, stand out to me in terms of scope. The first is that we have a practice of setting scope through agreeing on shared use cases. IIIF is fundamentally about interoperability and shared ways of doing things. So we focus on widely shared use cases. And the second part is about the idea that when we come up with a solution to something, we want to come up with the solution that's the simplest we can do, not simpler, obviously. And then finally, just in case it isn't obvious, the IIIF specifications are open so that anyone can use them to do wonderful, possibly terrible, and certainly gloriously absurd things with them. The idea of this scope discussion is about where the community should focus rather than on controlling any use of the outputs of the community which are open. So I guess I'll start off with sort of asking the full question, and maybe we'll get parts of the answers depending on how bold people are feeling. So the question is, what do you think the appropriate scope of IIIF, the community, and the consortium is? Or if that seems a little bold, how should we think about that focus? And then if you'd like to try with some examples, can you suggest something new that would be in scope and something new that you think would be out of scope? And maybe we'll start off with Tom.
So to answer which question first, the scope of IIIF itself or a technical, I'll go for a technical thing. So obviously descriptive metadata is out of scope because we're interested in presentation when we don't want to get into a argument about the meanings of terms across multiple different domains and subdomains and subdomains. So there are questions that come up often that are things the community could work on, but might be considered out of scope because they are leaning towards descriptive semantics. And sometimes we have to kind of control ourselves and not go down that path to keep IIIF purely about presentation semantics. That would be one kind of scope principle that we try to stick to that might not be obvious to people coming to the community for the first time. I guess another topic would be the kinds of material that should be presented by IIIF. So I mean, it's probably the biggest scope, and I know Rob might want to jump in as well. But the institutions hold a lot of material of different types. Some of that material is images, so that's kind of obviously fits into IIIF. A lot of that material is audiovisual, and so that became part of IIIF. That seemed a natural extension of the scope, despite the acronym, despite the I in the acronym. 3D is adding another dimension. That seems like a big extension of scope, but still an extension rather than something new entirely, although it's fraught with difficulty, as you saw from Julie's presentation. But archives and libraries have born digital materials and other things. Are they in scope for IIIF? How do we accommodate that kind of stuff?
Thanks, Tom.
I jump in then.
Whoever wants to go next. Yeah.
Yeah. So then 3D is clearly in scope. But yeah, I would say that the Word document isn't really in scope. You could do a Word a full text in a IIIF presentation API, but it would be like writing a novel in PowerPoint rather than in Word. It's not the right tool for the job. Some other scoping things, I would say that a binary API for audiovisual is in scope, but not necessarily necessary, because there's other patterns on the web that give us the same affordances that we have via the image API for images that aren't available by the web. Data management is probably in scope. We've just never really had a compelling enough use case to manage the creation, update, and deletion of IIIF resources in an interoperable way between systems. Perhaps with annotations being the exception, but there is the W3C annotation protocol for doing exactly that. So we sort of don't really need it. So yeah, it's the ability to lay out content rather than to define the content itself, or to provide access to that content in a coherent environment where the content can come from multiple institutions and multiple systems at the same time. That to me is the scope of IIIF, and where content, is something that you can put somewhere because it's presentation, rather than describe, to Tom's point about metadata being out of scope.
Thanks, Rob. Who else would like to chime in on this one?
I go next.
Yeah, I got one going. I was thinking a non-editor perspective would be good.
I can
chime in. Oh, sorry. Okay. Yeah, so this is Dawn Childress. I don't, mostly I defer to the more senior editors to answer questions like these, but I will just kind of talk about some of my thoughts. I think I'm still trying to fully understand, sort of where the spec, ends and other things begin, that, sort of thinking about the specification versus, the use cases and, UI and those types of things. But I will say that this, the idea that metadata itself is out of scope, I completely understand that. But I think there is also, cases where we think about, metadata as part of that presentation. And it may not be in scope right now, but I think there might be, it's worth discussing, how metadata can maybe become part of IIIF a little bit more, right? A little bit more in scope as far as thinking about use cases for that. And so my instinct is to kind of push back on that a little bit, but maybe I don't have any, specific arguments at the moment. I do think, though, when we're talking about scope, I think half of the group might be thinking about the specifications themselves, and the other half might be thinking about what can the community do. And it goes into this idea of adoption, of, how these are being used and what role does IIIF play in that. And so that, to me, is kind of an area where, scope can be talked about a little bit more, expanded a little bit more, so that we can get more of those use cases and understand them a little bit more, and for when we do need to extend, the spec or broaden the scope of the spec, not just extend like in the case of 3D.
Glenn, did you want to?
I did. I mean, it's mostly adding to what Dawn was saying, really, that I think there are kind of three different areas. So there's the IIIF specifications, there's the IIIF community, and then there's IIIF tools. And each really, I think, have different scopes in some ways. So it was really interesting to hear the citation discussion earlier. And there's always discussion in the community about whether that's kind of a tool thing or that's a IIIF standard thing. And potentially it's a IIIF community that kind of pulls that together. So I think there is kind of scope, but there are different scopes. So spec, community, and also tools. And maybe the community is wider than the standard. So it'd be interesting to talk about the 3D when they're talking about kind of different tools and workflows. And that might not be something that goes into the IIIF specification, but it might be something that's kind of comes through the IIIF community group and the technical group. So that I think there's a lots of different kind of scope discussions we could have.
And Jeff.
And I'm sorry, can I just add one more thing to that, especially the tools, because I think there is a place for that, but what those are, I think is really going to vary by audience. And, one of the things that I think would be, a really interesting conversation to have is to discuss the why. Why are these things not in scope right now? Because there are, certainly benefits, but there are also downsides, right? So when you're trying to create a spec that is interoperable, and is available to and usable by the largest number of people, usually when you focus in on a tool, you're kind of limiting yourself to a couple of different features, and it becomes a little bit more boutique, and it only answers the needs of a small subset of the community. And I think that's part of the reason why the idea of tools are not in here. So identifying what those are, but having that discussion about what are the downsides to those things, and kind of weighing those, the upsides and downsides. So more people maybe have an understanding of why the IIIF isn't responsible for developing tools for educational use of IIIF materials and so on.
Thanks, Dawn. Jeff, did you want to comment on the starting point here?
Yeah, I guess just to follow up on what Dawn and Glenn had said, and also being sort of a new member of the editorial committee, I working at OCLC, I'm going to put my aggregator's hat on for a second and sort of emphasize the distinction that Dawn had pointed out between sort of the technical specifications, so what the community group is doing, the community groups are doing, and then the tools used to sort of pull those things together. And I think that from my perspective, I find aggregation very important and in scope across all three of those sort of categories of IIIF work. And so in the specifications area, you see the change discovery API and the work of the discovery TSG, working towards discoverability, aggregation, et cetera. From the community group, you see the D4H group, the Discovery for Humans group, working on sort of the best practice around metadata to help facilitate interoperability and discoverability and aggregation. And in the tools sort of tools area. I'm not quite sure where it fits there. I'm sure there is something I'm not familiar or aware of, but I think that when we talk about what's in scope, I'd like to think of it as in scope for specifications, in scope for the community to help figure out best practices, and then in scope for tools that help facilitate and pull together the work of the community groups and the specification groups. And it's not to silo them, it's just saying they all work together. And I think that when you talk about scope, you need to be sort of specific about scope for what in IIIF.
Yeah, just to elaborate on one of Jeff's examples there, the use of descriptive metadata is very much out of scope for the specs, other than providing a very clear way of pointing at it via the see also property, but very much in scope for the work of the D4H group in understanding what might be required for metadata, indexable metadata to drive discovery systems. So that's an example where the spec scope and the community scope are actually very different, and for very good reasons, and completely fine reasons.
Great. So I think we've had several echoes of dividing notions of focus into three areas: the specs, where we have the best developed notions of scope, the community, and tools. I notice Lisa has a hand up, so I was just about to encourage questions from the audience. Lisa, would you like to ask or make your comment?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Lisa McCauley. I work at UCLA Library. And the question I have is the reason, why are we asking this question? And I wonder, Simeon, you sounded a little, concerned as you presented scope, and you expressed why scope is an important thing to consider. Like, in order to have an effective group, we need a manageable, achievable scope. Could you talk about what brings you to ask this question at this time? Is there an undue pressure on scope? Is there a splintering effect, like where we're going in lots of different directions, so this is important, or this is just sort of like a healthy check-in? So just kind of wondering if we're at a breaking point where it feels like the plane's shaking too much, or if this is just like, oh, this is temperature taking.
From my perspective, it's really temperature taking, part of thinking, what makes the IIIF evolve in a useful and helpful way. I guess perhaps my comments reflect some of my views, which are around a fairly sort of controlled expansion of scope, because I think it's critically important to build critical mass of things as we build them before we move too hastily to the next shiny object. But that's my view. I don't know if anyone else would like to comment on that one. It's a great question, thank you.
Yeah, I wonder if I can just jump in and say, absolutely great question. I think we've just released version 3 of IIIF, and we're kind of in the position now where we'll look which direction we go, and these kind of opportunities don't come very often. So that's kind of why we're doing this now, is that we've released version 3, and now we're kind of horizon scanning and saying which direction do we go for, say, the next 4 years. Although, this is kind of ideas and discussions, not kind of a final decision.
Anyone else?
I would just think also with the expansion of the IIIF community, there are so many more voices, there's so many more use cases. So it just seems like a good time to sort of take stock of what's out there, what people are thinking as the audience grows larger.
Well, let me pose another question then. So far, the IIIF centralized work on tooling has been around validation tooling. So Glenn doing most of the heavy lifting with some community supports some validators for existing specifications. Would anyone like to comment on other tooling they think would be critical in driving IIIF forward? had a couple of comments. For example, in the last session, Ben Bacala suggested perhaps a playground or something might help. Interested in support for that idea or other ideas?
Maybe just while people are thinking and typing. So as well as the validators that we support centrally to kind of help people implement the presentation and image API, we've also been recently developing a lot more tools for training. So we run this 5-day training course, and as part of that, we now host Workbench, which we've presented earlier about hosting IIIF images and manifests as part of the training, but also open to other people. And we've also got an annotation workbench for people to try annotations. So I think they're the kind of the main areas that we kind of focus on centrally at the moment, is the validators and tools for training, and then the website and other things like guides and cookbooks. So yeah.
Not to sound too negative about it, but there's also the consideration of the cost of building really high quality software and how much money the consortium would have to throw at it. I mean, if you consider something like Mirador or Universal Viewer, the amount of labor that's encapsulated in those products is quite huge. And similarly for other tools and platforms. So that, there is a kind of a real sort of limit to how far, if funds are unlimited, you could build tooling that was like Adobe Premiere or just really high quality content creation tools and content management tools for IIIF resources, but they come at a cost.
So just to put you on the spot a bit, Tom, does that mean you would be fairly circumspect at what tooling we might get into supporting?
I mean, I have to declare a conflict of interest here, because I work for a commercial organization that makes IIIF tooling for people. So you have to take what I say in that light. But I'm aware of what it costs to produce this kind of stuff, and I'm aware that the budgets of cultural heritage organizations are not that large. So there is that issue to consider. So, spending money on software for validation and things like that are self-contained, useful tools that can be accomplished. But I think, something like, say Mirador didn't exist and you wanted to go through the process of making it again, that was funded by, large sets of Mellon grants and huge amounts of institutional time donated to the project. That's a significant investment to have that kind of quality of software. So now it would be great to do all that kind of stuff, but it's just something to kind of think about when thinking about what the IIIF consortium should get behind, I guess.
Anyone else with thoughts on tools?
Yeah, to me, the consortium benefits from, I think Lisa was making the distinction between tools and tooling. The consortium benefits from supporting tooling, e.g. validators and playgrounds and ways to get people interested and be productive in development of IIIF tools. Whereas, as Tom says, the production, maintenance, training, advertising and so on of fully functional production quality clients or servers is an awful lot of work, and with possible to do the math on the income of the consortium, -3 full-time staff, that doesn't leave enough to really build tools at the scale that people would want them, particularly given the very robust community around providing tools such as Universal Viewer, Mirador, React IIIF we've already seen, heard of today, and so on. So yeah, anything that promotes adoption rather than is a production implementation seems like a really good centralizable thing, whereas the community can be responsible for the bigger, larger scale things. And if there's companies such as Gujarati, but Adobe was invoked. If Adobe wanted to build a IIIF product, we would welcome them with open arms, I think, because that would then bring IIIF to a much wider audience than open source tooling has with limited financial input.
Yeah. Hi guys, I'm Matthias. I'm typing in the chat all the time, so I just want to show my face. I have a déjà vu with the early days of the World Wide Web. You just mentioned Adobe. I worked for Adobe, but this doesn't matter. So the first steps of the World Wide Web have been the CERN, so the scientific community. Then there was Amaya, which was a web browser editor provided by the W3C. But then the commercial world took over and it went downhill. So with Netscape and so on, you know the story as well as I do. So commercializing IIIF might turn us into a direction that we don't really want, or at least we should be very careful about it and see who earns money to what extent with the IIIF format that we are designing over here. And in addition to that thought, I think that it's even more complicated than what we all think, because we have two viewers and one format and lots of parties who work on our initiative. So from the end user's point of view, it's rather confusing. So he visits any kind of GLAM, like the British Library, for example. You made a decision for Universal Viewer, and Stanford, for example, chose on Mirador. But this is totally different worlds for the end user. Think video. You go to YouTube, you see videos. You go to Vimeo, you see videos. But no user even encounters the idea that video is video, and then you can exchange the player to have different properties. And so this is really very tricky and interesting and important step for our users to learn, that they can make a choice on the viewer because they get different features that fits their work. And I think we have lots of interesting work to do. And so here I am, and I contribute with critique and feedback and design decisions.
Thanks, Matthias. It's great to put a face to the comments. I noticed that Mike has joined us. Mike, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Mike Appleby, one of the editors. I work at Yale University Library.
Right. So I think I'd like to, there have been a lot of comments, more than we will get through. I'd like to follow up on Tom Kramer's comment, which I think has created some follow-on discussion. If you drew a Venn diagram showing the specs, tools, and community, where are the strong overlaps and where are the disjoint areas? So I don't know if anyone would like to comment on where they think we have a real consensus. I will say, for example, that on the original use case of the IIIF image API and the work around images, we clearly have a strong overlap of all of those things, but I think maybe there are other areas that are less so. So I could give Mike the first opportunity if he would like to comment, or anyone else. Or if Tom would like to jump in and expand on the comment.
I think if we're talking about where we go next, to the degree that we have disjoint areas, if tools are doing things outside of the specs, or specs are specifying things that have never been built in a tool, or the community is clamoring for something totally different, those might be good areas where to focus to bring things more in alignment. So not necessarily specs, not necessarily tool development, but it could be, I guess, in any of the three circles.
I'll jump in quickly. I think, Simeon, as you suggested, there's probably 100% overlap at the center and less overlap as you get out towards the edges, particularly with things like the authentication API, where the web is changing around authentication and privacy and third-party cookies and so on. And authentication is not one of the sort of primary foci of the IIIF community, which is more about open access and so forth. So I would put the least overlap around the authentication API, and then the most overlap around image presentation, somewhere in the middle. There's features that aren't as well implemented as we might like, but we do know that every feature has at least one implementation somewhere. So there's not perhaps as much coverage, as much duplication, but there's certainly some. And then search, maybe there's fewer content search implementations than we would like, given how long it's been around. But the flip side is, there's not that many full text transcriptions of large repositories of documents available with IIIF images, and the ones that I think we know about all do support it. So that's great. So yeah, again, the core is very, very well covered. The external parts, the ones that we've added over time, less well developed, and I think that's probably a healthy thing. We might, if the web doesn't support the authentication workflow, we might need to get rid of the authentication spec and just say, this isn't something that is supported by modern browsers anymore. I don't think we should be too reticent, too reluctant to say, this spec is no longer needed, if that's the case.
Anyone else want to follow up with that? So I think in the chat stream, Tom just hit on one of the questions I really have, is that the notion of annotations, semantic annotations at that, are built into the IIIF specs at the very foundation, but really see, I think, rather limited adoption. And I think there's relevance there in some of the scholarly use cases we've heard talked on in previous sessions. What's the missing piece there?
I think the scenario is not quite as bleak there, though, because I think there is a lot of adoption. It's just kind of not immediately obvious. You think of crowdsourcing platforms like From the Page, or the we run several crowdsourcing projects. They're all using W3C annotations. You look at kind of storytelling tools, they're using W3C annotations to drive narratives. There's a lot of non-obvious use of the web annotation data model in IIIF application and software, but there isn't the kind of widespread use of students annotating work in using W3C annotations on IIIF and then submitting their homework, or that kind of wider use. But I think there is a lot more use of W3C web annotations and IIIF than is immediately apparent on the surface.
So would it be right to paraphrase your answer as this is kind of this is happening? It's a bit of a sleeper, but it's there. Anyone else?
Yeah, the annotation has the creation of annotations rather than the rendering of annotations, to be specific, has the issue of authentication and the social network sorts of effects that not everyone wants everyone else to be able to see all of their notes about things. So whether there's tooling or not is a different question. Whether there's content, yeah, I'm with Tom. There is a lot of content. It's just that we don't see it. It's below it's the iceberg, right? We see the 10%, but there's a big 90% sitting below the waterline as well.
I think at least in some of the cases Tom was mentioning too, the viewers are bespoke viewers that understand a particular annotation profile, and so you need that. You don't have quite the same interoperability story we have with a plain manifest, and so that can make the lift heavier if you're starting a new project, because you likely don't have the viewer that's going to do the thing you need to do off the shelf without more customization.
Yeah, that's not necessarily a bad. I mean, so Nikki puts the example of using an annotate. Yeah, it's using interoperable material. It might, it's not gonna, you're not necessarily going to be able to play that back in any IIIF viewer you find, but it's totally meeting the use cases and doing the job. So that seems fine to me.
Nikki, would you like to comment on the experience of having students use annotations for their homework?
Sure. I mean, for the record, Annotate is interoperable. All the manifests that are created in the application work with Mirador and Universal Viewer, I believe. I haven't tested with Universal Viewer, but they're all in IIIF spec, and so are the annotations. Those are in W3 Web Annotation Standard. So you can actually go and load those into different viewers. One of the classes we used it for was to annotate the Bayou Tapestry, which we used it for a graduate school class, and the students were basically given a list of items to go find in a scavenger hunt. And so what they ended up doing was we had them logged into 4 different iPads, and they looked on, we were using our high-tech space that has a 360-degree view. So we had a version of the Bayou up on that 360-degree view, and we had a version where they could go into the iPad and annotate it. So they would look on the screen and then go ahead and zoom in on those iPads, and went ahead and annotated it. And then we viewed it in Anona, which works on a 360-degree view screen, and went through all their annotations, and they presented to the class. The second half of that class, they ended up giving, they had a second activity where they were given like certain parts of a scene in a comic book, and were asked to identify those on the Bayou Tapestry. And I will put links to the results of these classes because they are publicly viewable. But they basically were supposed to find like scene to scene transitions, which happen in comics on the Bayou, and they annotated that and again presented to their classmates using Anona. The second class we had was a undergraduate honors class in English. So they were basically, again, in the same high-tech space, which was our visualization studio. We ended up scanning copies of The Arrival, which is a comic book without any dialogue. And they were given a worksheet where they were basically told, and they all logged in on their own personal machines with their own GitHub usernames. And they were basically told to, add dialogue or add their comments to these, to the pages. And then we viewed them. And again, people present, like we gave them about 30 minutes to add annotations. And then we loaded it in Anona and showed it to the students and went through their annotations, and they talked about their annotations. And then of course, at the end, there's a link for them that they can go back and look at other people's annotations, etc. So that was kind of my experience.
Thank you. That's great. And I see in the chat from Trip and Matthias as well. So it's lovely to see a sub-community of people using this in teaching. Any other questions around scope? Someone wants to highlight something from the chat. I haven't picked up everything because there's too much there.
We're talking about the future scope. Do we have an agreement? What's the current scope? So is it cultural digitized object from galleries, libraries, archives? Is this the common denominator of the current scope for what we are discussing? So old objects without copyright, is this something which is our current scope?
So I would argue, while that's a very important use case, that has never been the defining scope of IIIF work. So witness, for example, work on authentication, the use of, say, the welcome list to use authenticated access to material that's newer or restricted. I wonder if maybe Glenn, you could comment from the perspective of the IIIFC, how you talk about the members or prospective members.
Yeah, I was going to agree. I mean, that's definitely where we've come from, and that's definitely the history of IIIF is in cultural heritage. But we wouldn't want to tie it just to cultural heritage, and it's something we'd like to increase. We've seen recently, great increase in the natural history domain, and it would be great to increase it in more STEM subjects. I think almost all of the consortium members are from cultural heritage institutions, which will obviously give us a bias to cultural heritage, but it's not something where we want to expand to other places, not just cultural heritage.
And obviously the specs themselves don't make any comment on the kinds of materials they might be being used to present.
A simple point is, if we don't know what our current scope is, then we can't discuss where we want to go. And if we are agnostic regarding the content, then everything's fine, isn't it?
Well, is there anyone who think we're not agnostic?
Well, we don't care whether it's old documents or climate data of the future prognostics. We simply don't care, because the IIIF format makes no assumptions regarding the content. So it's maybe our job to promote the stuff that's already there to new communities, as you just said, Glenn, the stems or biogenetics or whatever. I mean, I imagine to zoom into the human genome using IIIF. Has it been done already? I make it up, but it should be fairly possible. What do you think? So all the chromosomes as zoomable 3D content.
Just one observation from kind of the occasional overlap with STEM use cases for IIIF. You find that, like a typical STEM use case, or say, well, actually, I've got 3 billion annotations on this image, or this, the source image for this deep zoom is like 2 petabytes. The kind of scale of data being that software needs to deal with is usually orders of magnitude different from cultural heritage data. So that doesn't mean that IIIF is not applicable, but it's really, really interesting to kind of hear these STEM use cases.
Yeah,
yeah.
I think there's definitely a bias in the history and development of IIIF, obviously, towards rasterized or images and digitized avian things, and that opens questions as soon as you have born digital material in other sorts of formats. Is that within scope and whatever? But I think, unfortunately, we have to wrap up this session. I hope maybe, Meg, if you can grab the latest copy of this chat before we go, that would be great. And thank you, everyone, for joining. Thank you for participating in the first day of the full working meeting, and see you in the remaining days.
Okay, thanks all. So we will be back on tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern.
Yeah, thanks everyone for a great discussion.
All right, bye all. See you tomorrow.
Thanks. Bye.
Thanks all.
Everyone, thank you.